evening started like any other community event. The town's old hall was filled with laughter, light chatter, and the smell of fresh coffee. Every year, the townspeople gathered here for the charity night where anyone could perform, sing, dance, or just tell a funny story. It wasn't a fancy show, just something to bring people together and raise money for the local shelter. The crowd wasn't large, maybe 100 people, most of whom knew each other by name. There was warmth in the air, the kind that came from shared memories and friendly faces. Children ran between the rows of chairs, their giggles mixing with the hum of conversation. The stage at the front wasn't big either, just a wooden platform with an old upright piano sitting at one side. It had been there for years, a little out of tune but still holding its charm. As people took turns performing, the mood stayed light. There was laughter when a man tried to sing but forgot the lyrics halfway through. There was applause when two young girls danced shyly to a pop song. Everyone was relaxed, enjoying the night. Then, during a short break, someone noticed a man sitting quietly near the back. No one remembered seeing him before. He wasn't talking to anyone, just sitting with his hands folded and eyes lowered as if lost in thought. He didn't look like he belonged to the town. His clothes were plain, his face calm but unreadable. At first, nobody paid much attention. Small towns often had visitors, someone passing through, maybe staying at the inn. But when the host walked back onto the stage and cheerfully asked if anyone else wanted to perform before the next scheduled act, something unexpected happened. The quiet man at the back slowly raised his hand. A few heads turned, surprised. He stood up, hesitating for a second as if questioning his own decision. Then, without saying a word, he walked toward the stage. The sound of his shoes on the wooden floor seemed louder than usual. People exchanged glances, some curious, others unsure. "Would you like to sing?" the host asked with a friendly smile, trying to make him comfortable. The man shook his head. "The piano," he said softly. There was a small pause. The host nodded and stepped aside, motioning toward the instrument. The man approached it with care, as if it were something fragile and precious. He sat down, his posture straight but relaxed. For a moment he didn't move. His fingers hovered over the keys but didn't press them. It was as if he was waiting for something, a sign perhaps, or courage. The audience waited too. The chatter that had filled the hall earlier began to fade. People whispered to each other quietly. "Who is he? Does anyone know him? Maybe he's a traveler." The man seemed unaware of the eyes watching him. He looked down at the piano keys, taking a deep breath. There was a stillness around him, a kind of silence that felt heavy but peaceful at the same time. Even the children who had been restless a few minutes ago were now quiet, sensing something different. Finally, he placed his hands on the keys. The first sound that came out was soft, just a few notes, unsure, almost testing. Then he paused again. It felt as if he was reconnecting with something buried deep inside him, something he hadn't touched in a long time. The piano was old, the keys slightly yellowed, but under his touch, it came alive. Slowly, his fingers began to move more confidently. The sound grew warmer, deeper, filling the hall. The melody that emerged was not a simple tune. It had emotion, layers of feeling that spoke in ways words couldn't. People leaned forward, caught off guard. They had expected a casual performance, maybe someone playing a familiar song, but this was something else entirely. The music rose and fell like a story. There was sadness in it, but also beauty. It carried a kind of quiet strength, as if he was telling the world about pain and healing all at once. The notes flowed from him naturally, like water finding its path through stones. The crowd was completely still now. Not a single whisper. It was as though everyone was holding their breath. The sound filled every corner of the hall, echoing softly off the old wooden walls. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes, unsure why she felt tears coming. Even those who didn't understand music could feel something stirring inside them. The melody spoke to everyone differently. For some, it reminded them of loss. For others, it brought back forgotten memories of love or hope. The man at the piano didn't look up once. His eyes stayed on the keys, but his face showed everything: concentration, pain, release. It was like watching someone open a door to their soul. When the final note came, it hung in the air for a few seconds, trembling softly before fading away. And for that moment, the silence that followed was louder than the music itself. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then, slowly, people began to clap. The applause started small, almost hesitant, but it grew quickly into something powerful. Some stood up, others whistled. It wasn't just appreciation. It was emotion and raw and real. The man stood up, gave a small nod, and smiled faintly. There was gratitude in his eyes, but also something else. Sadness, perhaps, or relief. He looked around once, then quietly stepped down from the stage. The host tried to speak, his voice slightly shaky. That was incredible. Sir, may we know your name? The man paused, turning slightly toward the microphone. He seemed unsure whether to answer. Then in a low, calm voice he said, "Just someone who used to play." And with that he walked back to his seat. The audience was left in awe. People began to murmur again, this time in wonder. "Did you hear that? I've never heard anything like it." He said he used to play, I wonder where. The rest of the evening carried on, but something had changed. Every act that followed felt quieter, smaller. The man didn't perform again or speak to anyone. When the event ended and people started leaving, he slipped out silently through the side door. Outside, the air was cool and still. The faint sound of laughter from inside echoed through the street, but he didn't look back. He stood under the dim streetlight for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air. Then he began walking down the empty road, his hands in his pockets. No one knew who he was or why he had decided to play that night. Maybe it was chance, or maybe something inside him had finally pushed him to share what he had kept hidden for years. Whatever it was, it left a mark on everyone who was there. Later, people would talk about it often. The night a quiet stranger sat at the piano and played like he was telling his heart's story. Some said they could still hear the echoes of that melody whenever they walked past the hall. Others said it felt like a dream, something unreal yet unforgettable. For the man, though, it wasn't about the applause or attention. It was something deeper. It had been years since he had touched a piano. There had been a time when music was his whole life. But life had changed in ways he never expected. Somewhere along the way, he had lost not just the music, but himself. That night, sitting at the old piano, something inside him had awakened again, a small spark that had been buried under years of silence. As his hands moved across the keys, he had felt everything he had been afraid to feel: pain, grief, love, and hope. He didn't know if he would ever play again, but for that one night, he had found a voice without needing to speak. And though he left quietly, his music stayed behind, in the hearts of everyone who heard it. The town would remember him not for his name, which no one ever learned, but for the feeling he left behind. It wasn't just a song. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful things in life come from the quietest souls. And somewhere down the road, under a dim streetlight, the stranger kept walking, the faintest smile on his face, the sound of his own music still echoing softly in his mind. After that night, the people in town couldn't stop talking about what had happened. The charity event had ended. The chairs were stacked and the hall lights turned off. But something from that evening still lingered in everyone's hearts. It wasn't just the music they remembered. It was the way it had made them feel. The next morning at the bakery, two women talked about the man as they waited for their bread. One said she had seen him near the old inn by the river. Another thought he might be staying with the caretaker who rented small rooms upstairs. Nobody really knew, but everyone was curious. By the afternoon, the story had already traveled through the town. People described him differently. Some said he was older, some said he was young. Some thought he was a lost artist, others believed he was a traveler passing through. But one thing everyone agreed on: the way he played had touched something deep inside them. Meanwhile, the man himself kept quiet. He had woken up early, long before sunrise, and sat by the window of his small rented room. The view outside was peaceful, the kind of morning where mist covered the river and the world felt half asleep. He watched the light slowly spread across the rooftops, feeling both heavy and light at the same time. On the small wooden table beside him sat an old notebook. The cover was worn, its edges torn. Inside were pages filled with faded handwriting and bits of music, pieces he had once written long ago. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the lines, remembering the life he once had. Years ago, music had been his entire world. He used to play in grand halls, where people dressed in their best clothes and lights shone bright above the stage. He remembered the smell of the polished piano wood, the quiet before a concert began, the rush of sound when he touched the first note. He remembered applause, travel, faces of people who came to listen. Back then, everything seemed like it would last forever. But forever had ended suddenly. One tragic day had taken away what he loved most, not just music but the reason behind it. After that, every melody became a reminder of what he had lost. So he stopped playing. He locked away his piano, closed his notebook, and disappeared from the world that once celebrated him. Years passed. He wandered from one place to another, never staying too long, taking small jobs just to survive. He tried to forget, but silence can be loud when you're carrying pain, and in that silence sometimes he heard music again, faintly in the back of his mind. But he never let it out until last night. He hadn't planned to play. He had only gone to the event because he'd seen the sign on the notice board outside the hall, something about community gathering and open performance. He thought maybe he could sit in the back, feel the warmth of people, remind himself what it was like to be around joy again. But when the host asked if anyone wanted to perform, something in him stirred. Maybe it was the laughter of the children, maybe the sight of that old piano sitting quietly at the corner waiting. He didn't know why he raised his hand. It just happened. And once his fingers touched the keys, it was as if time had stopped. Every feeling he had buried for years came rushing back: pain, love, longing. But instead of breaking him, it freed him. Now, sitting by the window the next morning, he thought about it again. He wondered what the people had seen in his music. Maybe they didn't see him at all. Maybe they only heard pieces of their own stories through his song. A soft knock came at his door. He turned and opened it slowly. It was the woman from the inn holding a tray with breakfast. "Morning," she said kindly. "You were at the hall last night, weren't you?" He gave a small smile and nodded. "I thought so," she said. "Everyone's talking about it." "You played beautifully." He thanked her softly, his eyes warm but distant. She placed the tray on the table, a cup of tea, bread, and some fruit. And before leaving, she paused. "If you ever want to play again, the church piano is open to anyone. It's old, but it still sounds nice." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, then at the notebook on the table. "I'll think about it," he said. When she left, he sat for a long time, the tea untouched. His fingers brushed the edge of the notebook again. The thought of playing in a church and a quiet, peaceful place didn't sound bad. But another part of him hesitated. He was afraid that the music would bring back too much, that it would remind him of everything he had tried to forget. That evening, he went for a walk. The town was small, surrounded by gentle hills and tall trees that swayed with the wind. The air smelled of wood and rain. He passed by children playing in the street, an old man feeding birds, and a small shop with a radio playing soft tunes. Everywhere he went, life moved simply, beautifully. It reminded him of a time before everything had gone wrong, when small things brought joy. He stopped near the park where the sound of a young boy playing a harmonica floated through the air. The notes were uneven, sometimes off-key, but filled with innocence. It made him smile. He sat on a bench and closed his eyes. He remembered when he was a child, first learning the piano. His teacher had once told him, "Music is not about perfection. It's about feeling." Back then he didn't fully understand, but now after all these years those words made sense. He had spent so much of his life chasing perfection. The perfect performance, the perfect sound, the perfect control. But the night before, when he had played from the heart, raw and unpolished, that was when it truly meant something. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with soft orange light, he found himself walking toward the church. He didn't plan it. His feet just carried him there. The door was slightly open and the faint smell of candles and wood filled the air. Inside it was quiet. The piano stood near the front, covered with a thin cloth. He hesitated before stepping closer. For a long moment he just stood there, looking at it. Then he slowly lifted the cloth and ran his fingers over the keys. Dust rose slightly in the air. He sat down again. The seat creaked under his weight. He pressed one key and a soft note echoed through the empty hall. It was a beautiful sound and fragile, like a whisper. He played another note, then another, until a small melody began to form. It wasn't planned. It was gentle and calm, like a memory of peace. As he played, he didn't notice that someone had entered quietly. It was a young boy from the town, maybe 12 years old, holding a book of hymns. He stood near the door, listening in silence. When the man finally stopped, he turned slightly and saw the boy. "That was nice," the boy said softly. It sounded happy and sad at the same time. The man smiled faintly. That's what life sounds like, he said. The boy grinned and walked closer. Can you teach me how to play like that someday? He looked at the boy for a long moment. He hadn't thought about teaching in years. The idea made him pause. There was a time when he had shared music with others, when it had been about connection, not perfection. Maybe this was his chance to start again slowly. Maybe, he said gently, one day. The boy nodded happily and ran off, his footsteps echoing down the aisle. The man stayed there a little longer, his fingers resting on the keys. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel lost. The quiet didn't hurt anymore. It felt peaceful. When he finally stood up and covered the piano again, he felt lighter. As he stepped outside, the night air brushed against his face. The stars were out, calm and bright. He looked up, breathed deeply, and for the first time in many years he smiled, not because of the past, but because of what might still come. He didn't know where life would take him next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done with music yet. And somewhere in that little town, the echo of his notes still lingered, soft, healing, and full of life. The next few days passed quietly in the small town. Life went on as usual. Shopkeepers opened their stores. Children ran down the narrow streets to school, and the old clock tower rang every hour, marking time in its patient rhythm. Yet, for those who had been at the charity event that night, something still lingered in their hearts. Whenever they passed the hall, they remembered the stranger sitting at the piano, the soft notes, the silence, the emotion. The memory had become part of the town's story. The man himself had begun to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. It was fragile, like a thin glass that could break any moment, but it was there. Each morning he woke up, opened the window, and listened to the town wake up too. The sound of the river, footsteps on the cobblestones, distant voices. They felt comforting, real. He had started visiting the church piano every evening. Sometimes he would play a few soft tunes, sometimes just sit there in silence. The sound of his own playing no longer frightened him. It no longer felt like reopening a wound. Instead, it felt like slowly stitching it back together. One afternoon, as he walked through the market, he heard someone call out softly, "Hey, sir." He turned to see the same young boy who had listened to him in the church. The boy ran up, holding a small piece of paper folded in his hand. "I wrote this," the boy said, slightly out of breath. "It's a song I made up. Can you see if it's any good?" The man took the paper and looked at it. It was clumsy, the notes uneven, the handwriting shaky. But there was something pure about it, something that reminded him of the first time he'd tried to write music himself. "This is good," he said gently. "You have a feeling in these notes. That's what matters most." The boy's eyes lit up. "Will you teach me more?" He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he was ready to take that step. Teaching meant opening up again, connecting, sharing a part of himself he had kept hidden for years. But when he looked at the boy's hopeful face, he couldn't say no. "All right," he said. "Meet me at the church after sunset." That evening, the boy arrived early, his excitement impossible to hide. The man smiled and motioned for him to sit beside him on the piano bench. "Before you play," he said softly, "you must listen. Music isn't only in your hands. It's here." He tapped his chest lightly. "It starts with feeling." The boy nodded seriously. He pressed one key and the sound rang out gently. The man told him to close his eyes and play another. Slowly, they built a small melody together, uneven, imperfect, but full of life. As the lesson went on, the man found himself smiling more than he had in a long time. The boy laughed every time he hit the wrong key, and the laughter filled the quiet church like sunlight breaking through clouds. After a while, they stopped. The boy looked up eagerly. "Can we play again tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," the man said, nodding. When the boy left, the man stayed behind, sitting in the empty hall. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows. He stared at the piano keys, feeling something stir inside him, something warm, alive. He hadn't realized how much he missed sharing music. For so long he had thought of it as a painful memory, but now, through this small connection, it was becoming something else. A bridge between hearts. That night, he couldn't sleep. The moonlight spilled across the floor of his room, and he sat by the window with his old notebook in hand. He turned its pages slowly, reading the old pieces he had written long ago. Then he picked up a pencil and began to write again. At first, the lines were hesitant, but soon his hand moved more freely. It wasn't a song of sorrow this time. It was gentle, hopeful, almost like a conversation between past and present. He didn't know what to call it yet, but he knew what it meant. It was the sound of healing. Days turned into weeks. The lessons with the boy continued, and sometimes a few curious people would stop by to listen. Soon others wanted to learn too. A teenage girl who sang softly. A man who used to play the guitar when he was young. An elderly woman who said she just wanted to remember what music felt like again. The small church, once silent, began to fill with sound. Some evenings it was filled with laughter, sometimes with soft tunes echoing through the air. The man never asked for money, never took credit. He just played and helped others play. People started calling him the quiet pianist. But even though he smiled more now, there were still moments when the past found him. Sudden, heavy moments when he remembered faces he would never see again. When that happened, he would walk to the riverbank late at night and let the wind carry his thoughts away. One night, as he sat by the water, the boy found him there. He held the small paper where they had written their first song together. "I played it for my mother," the boy said proudly. "She said it made her cry." The man smiled softly. "Then you did it right," he said. "Music is meant to make people feel." The boy sat beside him, quiet for a while, then looked up. "Why do you look sad when you play sometimes?" The man didn't answer immediately. He stared at the reflection of the moon on the river and said, "Because sometimes when you love something deeply, it hurts too. But that's what makes it beautiful." The boy didn't completely understand, but he nodded. Then, with his childlike honesty, he said, "I think your music makes people happy even when it's sad." Those words stayed with him long after the boy went home. That night, he wrote again in his notebook, this time a melody inspired by the boy's words. It was soft and full of hope. He imagined playing it not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever needed comfort, everyone who had ever felt lost. He didn't know that soon. The whole town would hear that song. A few days later, the local community decided to hold another small event, a spring gathering at the same hall where he had first played. The host invited him again, but this time with a warm smile, not curiosity. "We'd love for you to perform," she said. "People still talk about that night. They'd be happy to hear you again." He thought about it for a while. Performing again in front of everyone, it frightened him a little. But deep down he felt ready. Not to impress, not to prove anything, but to share. When the night came, the hall was full once again. Candles flickered, children whispered in excitement, and there was that same feeling of warmth in the air. When his turn came, he walked to the stage quietly, just like before. But this time the fear was gone. The faces looking up at him weren't strangers anymore. They were people who had become part of his story. He sat down, adjusted the bench, and opened his notebook. Inside was the new melody he had written, the one that carried both sadness and light. As he began to play, the room fell silent. The music was gentle, flowing like the river outside. It rose softly, filled with longing, and then melted into something peaceful. It wasn't just a song. It was a message. That pain could turn into beauty. That loss could lead to new beginnings. Some people closed their eyes. Some smiled. Some wiped away quiet tears. When the last note faded, the silence lingered for a long moment. The same silence that had followed his first performance, but this time, it was different. It was warm, full, alive, then slowly. Applause filled the hall again, loud, joyful, genuine. He stood up, bowed slightly, and smiled, a real unguarded smile. That night, as he left the hall, he didn't walk alone. People greeted him, thanked him, and asked him to come back. The boy ran up to him, holding his hand proudly. "You did it again," the boy said, beaming. Everyone felt it. He looked down at the boy, then at the stars above, and said softly, "No, we did." And as they walked together through the quiet streets, the sound of music still seemed to float behind them, soft, endless, and alive. After the second performance, something in the town began to change quietly. It wasn't sudden or loud, just small things that people noticed in their daily lives. The sound of music, once rare, started to drift through the air again. The piano at the church that had been silent for years was now played almost every evening. People passing by would stop for a moment just to listen. Some came inside, sat in the back, and stayed there quietly, letting the sound wash over them. The man who once kept to himself was no longer just a quiet stranger. People greeted him on the street now. Children waved. Shopkeepers nodded as he passed by. The old woman who sold flowers outside the bakery always placed a small bloom on his table when he came for tea. Slowly, without realizing it, he had become part of their lives. The young boy still came every day for his lessons. Sometimes he brought friends who wanted to learn too. The man never said no. He taught them not through strict notes or heavy words, but through feeling. Music, he would tell them, is like breathing. You don't think too hard. You just let it flow. One evening, as the sun began to fade behind the hills, he sat at the piano with the boy beside him. The church was quiet, filled with that familiar golden light. The boy looked thoughtful, his small fingers resting on the keys. "Do you ever get scared before you play?" the boy asked suddenly. The man smiled softly. "I used to. A long time ago I was terrified every time. I wanted to be perfect." "Were you?" the boy asked. He shook his head gently. "No one ever is. But I learned that people don't remember perfection. They remember emotion. They remember how you make them feel." The boy nodded slowly, trying to understand. Then he asked, "Is that why people cried when you played at the hall?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the stained glass window where the light shimmered in colors across the wall. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe they felt something real. Sometimes that's all people need, a reason to feel again." The boy was silent for a while, then began to play a simple melody they had practiced together. It was uneven but full of heart. The man listened with a faint smile. He could tell the boy was learning not just to play but to speak through music. As the final note faded, the man reached out and rested a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're doing well," he said softly. "Better than you think." From that day on, the lessons became more than music. They became moments of connection, laughter, stories, small silences that said more than words could. The boy reminded him of himself when he was younger, curious, full of wonder, believing that music could change the world. But late at night, when he was alone, the man still felt the old ache inside him, the quiet reminder of everything he had lost. He didn't fight it anymore, but it lingered like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. Sometimes, while sitting at the window, he'd find his mind drifting back to faces he hadn't seen in years. His wife, his little boy. Their laughter, their voices, the warmth that used to fill his home. It was both painful and beautiful. One night, as he played softly in the church, he felt someone standing near the door. He looked up and saw the host from the charity event, the same kind woman who had invited him to play the first time. She smiled gently, walking closer. "I was hoping I'd find you here," she said. "You've brought this whole town back to life, you know." He shook his head lightly. "I didn't do anything. I just played." "That's what I mean," she replied. "Sometimes a bit of honesty and sound can remind people of what they forgot, that they still have hearts." He smiled, a little embarrassed. She sat down nearby, listening quietly as he played again. The melody was soft and reflective, the kind that made the room feel both alive and still. When he finished, she said softly, "Would you play at the summer festival next month?" "It would mean a lot to everyone." He hesitated. He hadn't played at a large event in years, not since before his life had changed. The thought of standing in front of a big crowd again brought back old feelings. Not fear, but something deeper. A quiet question inside him. "I'll think about it," he said gently. That night, as he walked home, the streets were quiet, the lamps glowing softly. He thought about her words, about how the town had slowly become his home without him noticing. He had come here with nothing, only his silence and his grief, and now somehow that silence had turned into music again. The next few days went by quickly. People were already talking about the upcoming festival, setting up stalls, preparing food, planning performances. The boy couldn't stop talking about it either. "You have to play," the boy said excitedly. "Everyone's waiting to hear you again." "I'll be there too. I'll sit right in the front." The man laughed softly. "You sound more excited than I am." "Because I know you'll play something amazing," the boy said with complete faith. That night, the man sat by his piano long after everyone else had gone to bed. The notebook lay open in front of him. He turned the pages slowly until he reached the melody he had written weeks ago, the one born from the boy's innocent words. It was unfinished. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play it again, filling in the missing parts. The tune was different this time, lighter, warmer, full of life. It carried a quiet message of peace. He didn't think about the audience or applause. He thought about the boy, about the townspeople, about his loved ones who were gone but somehow still present in the music. When the festival day arrived, the whole town gathered at the square. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the smell of food cooking on open grills. Children ran around with ribbons, people danced in small circles, and the sound of joy carried everywhere. As the sun began to set, the stage lights came on. The host took the microphone and spoke cheerfully. "Tonight we have someone very special to thank, someone who reminded us what real music feels like." The crowd clapped and looked around. When the man stepped onto the stage, the sound of applause grew louder. Some cheered, others simply smiled, happy to see him again. He walked up to the piano. For a moment he just stood there, breathing in the soft evening air. The orange glow of the setting sun touched his face. He looked at the keys, then at the crowd, and finally at the boy sitting in the front row grinning proudly. Then he began to play. The first notes were soft, gentle as a whisper. Slowly the melody grew, rising and falling like waves. The sound carried through the open square, reaching every corner, every heart. It was a song of memory, loss, and healing, but also of love and renewal. People stopped talking. Some held hands. Others closed their eyes. Even the wind seemed to slow down, as if listening. The man's fingers moved with quiet strength, every note flowing naturally. He wasn't performing, he was sharing. It was as if all the pieces of his life, the pain, the silence, the small joys he had found again, were all being poured into this one song. When he reached the final part, the music softened, fading slowly into stillness. The last note lingered in the air like a heartbeat, and then silence. No one clapped right away. They just sat there, breathing it in, holding on to the feeling. Then one by one, people stood and began to applaud, some with tears in their eyes. The boy clapped louder than anyone, his face glowing with pride. The man smiled, not the quiet, guarded smile from before, but a real one, full of peace. He stood, bowed slightly, and looked out over the crowd. For the first time in a long time, he felt whole again. That night, after the festival ended, he stayed by the river. The stars reflected in the water, and the sound of distant laughter still echoed faintly through the air. He closed his eyes and listened to the gentle rhythm of the waves. The music still played in his mind, but now it didn't belong only to him. It belonged to everyone who had heard it, everyone who had felt something through it. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a stranger anymore. He felt home. Days after the festival, the town still carried a quiet warmth in its air. Everywhere people went, they spoke about that evening. They said it was unlike any performance they had ever witnessed. It wasn't just the beauty of the music, it was what it made them feel. For some, it brought back memories long buried. For others, it gave them a kind of peace they didn't realize they were missing. The man, though, didn't talk much about it. He returned to his usual routine, morning walks by the river, quiet afternoons teaching, and evenings spent by the old piano. But there was something lighter about him now. The heaviness that once shadowed his steps had softened. People greeted him more warmly than ever. Children would wave and call out, "I'll play again," when he passed by. Shopkeepers would smile and say, "You made the whole town proud." He'd nod politely, always humble, never acting like a man who had changed anyone's life. But inside, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. One afternoon, while he was tuning the piano at the church, the boy came running in with excitement in his eyes. He held a folded piece of paper in his small hands. "They're writing about you," he said breathlessly. "Look." He unfolded the paper, and there it was, a small article in the local newspaper with a picture from the festival. The headline read, "Quiet Pianist Brings Town Together Through Music." The man smiled faintly and handed the paper back. "It's just a story," he said softly, "but it's about you." The boy insisted. He chuckled. "Maybe, but what matters isn't the story they write. It's the music that stays in people's hearts." The boy looked up at him curiously. "Do you think music can really stay forever?" The man paused, thinking. "I think the feeling does," he said after a moment. "People forget notes, but they don't forget how something made them feel. That's what lasts." The boy seemed to think about that for a while. Then he smiled shyly. "Can I write my own song one day?" "You already can," the man replied gently. Just listen, not to others, but to yourself. From that day, the boy began bringing small tunes he wrote on his own. Some were uneven, some too simple, but every single one had something honest in it. The man would listen, nodding quietly, guiding him with patience and care. Teaching that boy had become one of the most meaningful things in his life. Weeks turned into months and the seasons began to change. Autumn painted the leaves gold and crimson, and the town grew busier as people prepared for the colder days ahead. The piano in the church, once dusty and forgotten, now filled the space with warmth each evening. Sometimes the man played alone. Sometimes the boy joined. Sometimes people from the town gathered to listen quietly in the back. It became a habit, a kind of peace at the end of the day. One night the boy asked him, "Why do you never talk about your life before you came here?" The man was silent for a long time. The room was dimly lit by the candles on the windowsill. The faint hum of the night breeze drifted through the open door. He finally spoke, his voice soft and low. "Because for a long time I thought that part of my life was gone forever." Talking about it hurt too much. The boy frowned slightly. "But you don't have to forget everything, right?" He smiled faintly. "No, I don't forget. I just learned to carry it differently." He turned back to the piano and pressed a few gentle keys. The sound lingered in the quiet space. "Music taught me that even pain can become something beautiful when you give it shape," he said. "That's why I still play." The boy nodded slowly, not fully understanding yet, but feeling the weight in those words. Later that night, after the boy had gone home, the man stayed a while longer. He sat by the piano and looked out the window. The moonlight glowed softly on the wooden floor. He closed his eyes and began to play. Not for an audience, not for applause, but for the memories that still lived inside him. The melody was gentle, almost like a whisper. It carried traces of everything he had lived through, the joy, the loss, the quiet return of hope. For the first time in years, he didn't play to escape the past. He played to honor it. As the last note faded, he let out a slow breath. And then, for the first time in a long while, he smiled not with sadness, but with gratitude. The next morning, the church bell rang softly as people came in for their usual routine. The man was already there, helping to fix the old benches with the caretaker. He hummed under his breath as he worked. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was the sound of a man who had found calm after a long storm. A few days later, a letter arrived for him. It was from a music academy in the nearby city. Someone from the festival had sent them a recording of his performance, and they were inviting him to visit, to speak to young musicians about expression, not just skill. He read the letter several times, unsure what to feel. Part of him was hesitant. He had built a quiet, peaceful life here, but another part of him, the part that once believed in sharing music with the world, felt something stir. That evening, he spoke to the boy about it. "They want me to visit the city and talk to students," he said. The boy's eyes lit up. "You should go. They'll learn so much from you." He chuckled softly.
"You think so?"
"I know so," the boy said. "You always say music is about sharing what's inside you. Maybe it's time more people hear it." He looked at the boy for a moment, touched by the sincerity in his voice. "Maybe you're right," he said finally. The following week he traveled to the city, the same place he had left behind years ago. The streets were busier, louder, brighter than he remembered. When he entered the academy, he was greeted by a room full of young musicians eager to hear his story. He didn't talk much about fame or success. Instead, he spoke about silence, about finding meaning through pain, and about how true music comes from honesty, not perfection. When he played for them, the room fell completely still. Even the restless students listened with quiet wonder. Afterward, one of the teachers approached him. "Your playing reminds me why I fell in love with music in the first place," she said softly. He smiled humbly. "It reminded me too," he replied. When he returned to the town, the boy and the townspeople welcomed him warmly. That evening, the boy ran up to him, eager to tell him about the song he had finished while the man was away. "Can I play it for you?" the boy asked. "Of course," the man said, sitting beside him at the piano. The boy's hands trembled a little at first, but then he began to play. The tune was simple yet full of heart, full of everything he had learned. The man listened, proud and quiet. When the song ended, the man placed his hand gently on the boy's shoulder. That's your music, he said softly. No one else could have played it like you. The boy grinned, eyes bright. You taught me that. The man shook his head. No, he said kindly. You just needed someone to remind you it was already inside you.